So thank you very much for the kind introduction, but especially thank you to the Asian Center and to the Intervia for having me here today, but also for giving me the opportunity to serve here as Adjunct Professor. This has been started already in autumn, and it has been a great experience and opportunity to meet students in the Philippines and colleagues and to discuss ideas from these different perspectives. Because I think I'm a global historian with an interest in the Philippines and in Japan, and this is really what it takes. Different perspectives on issues of common interest. And in a way, hopefully this is also what my talk will be about, the samurai of the Philippines. All right. Exploring the genealogy of a popular trope. And by that, I mean, it has a popularized title, but the subtitle already takes away that it's a bit of a technical, slightly theoretical talk. So I hope there would be not too many disappointments. The interest in the subject comes from the already mentioned book, which is based on my PhD research 10 years ago, where I have particularly been looking at the beginning of Japanese presence in the Philippines, especially in Manila, their contributions to urban developments in Manila and the relationships between different ethnicities, especially with the Chinese and the Spanish. And then from that, I moved on to a project that is more closely linked to actual foreign relations, diplomatic relations, but also intellectual relations. And I tried to understand how our ideas of early modern, so 16th, 17th, 18th century foreign relations, contacts between different, let's call them pre-modern states for the sake of convenience, and actors are actually framed in the historiography. And I will say more about that later. And this is basically work that ended in a monograph that is hopefully forthcoming, called Translating Negotiations or Negotiating Imperialism, Murakami Naochiro's Archival Diplomacy, because this entire field and the development of these ideas is closely linked to the establishment of academic history in Japan. So just very briefly, some definitions linked to today's topic and the title. And we can start with samurai. What is a samurai? I think everyone has an image of a samurai in his or her head. And it's a very popular image. It's a very loaded and contested image. And none of these images, with the special hairdo of a samurai and katana and attire will appear in my presentation today. I'm sorry. And the samurai, in a way, it's an umbrella term for, of course, it means warrior in its most basic sense. And this is a bit the idea here. Who were these Japanese warriors that have a connection to history related to the Philippines? And in addition to that, a link to that, it's especially the ronin, the masterless samurai, that became a popular trope throughout the entire period of this contact. So since in the 16th century, the Japanese that came to Manila, some of them had probably a ronin background. And again, a bit more about that later. And the idea of the samurai is also very closely linked to the ideology, to the way of the warrior or the way of the samurai, known as Bushido. And this is an important concept because that's also an invention. Many of the concepts I talk about, their invention, their construction of historiography, very often with roots in the late 19th century, but then with changing meanings throughout the 20th century. And that links basically to the second concept here. What is a trope? A trope is a popular image or a stereotype, something that has in historiography very often to do with a narrative, so something that we connect to a certain concept. So then basically the last question to answer here, to get this out of the way, is just why and in which context do overused images, such in our case, the image of the samurai, actually matter? And this is not an easy question to answer. That's why the presentation will also deal with this. So just to say a bit about the ideas behind this in terms of research, there are various interpretive possibilities, of course, when we think about the samurai in Filipino history. And from a historiographical perspective, and then again, history and the methods we use in history, the questions we ask in history is just one way of looking at that. there is already research done on this in literary studies, for instance, or in popular culture, that of course is relevant for the bigger picture. But within history, it could be approached regionally, as has been the case with the history of the Japanese in the Philippines, especially from a Southern history perspective that is very much maritime, of course, thinking that we are talking about two island nations and all communication was via the sea. Then Japanese imperialism is also, in terms of ideology and mindset, an important field. And in that sense, in order to make a contribution to the historiography, it would be new imperial history, so history of imperialism that, among many things, also takes the smaller imperial powers or the new imperial powers, such as Japan, into account. And then there is the idea of looking at the global samurai as a cultural, political, whatever phenomenon. And there's currently a project called Global Samurai, based in the United Kingdom, collaboration between the University of York and the British Museum, I think, where they gathered many scholars of different disciplines and working on different regions and trying to explore this idea of the global samurai further, especially also taking into account the objects that have been collected around the globe, but also the image of the samurai and the ninja, etc., in film and in popular culture. But for me and for my interest in the samurai of the Philippines, it's mostly a way to combine a trope that has both visual qualities but also textual qualities with other types of archives. And as much as I like to emphasize that we need to go beyond the written archive, we also very much depend on the written archive. So much of my work is still based on texts, written narratives, and textual narratives but that then can give us new ideas about the phenomenon by deconstructing them, and through that decolonizing the narratives that are very popular and misleading very often. And then just to complete this, there are a couple of theories that we then, through this approach, can think about more. But let's start with the empirical material. In 1899, this Murakami Naochiro, that I've already introduced, wrote that, and in a sentimental way, somehow lamenting that the intercourse of Japan and the Western nations in the 16th and 17th century, with its romantic beginning, rapid growth, and sudden cessation after the lapse of a century, is a peculiarly attractive subject for our study. And our study means Japanese history. Unfortunately, Japanese materials on the subject are very scanty, most of the manuscripts and printed books having been destroyed by the Tokugawa government in pursuance of its policy of seclusion. We must therefore turn to foreign materials to supplement deficiency. And this, again, sorry, you can see that again. It's the introduction to an edited volume by Murakami Naochiro, and it tells you, of course, very much about the mindset of his time of 1899. So the interest was in relations between Japan and Western nations in this very period, when Japan also had an engagement with these Western nations, but then by default, of course, also with Southeast Asia, where some of these Western nations had their colonial bases. And then there comes in this methodological and historiographical aspect, that the Japanese sources that were produced during this exchange and relations in the 16th and 17th century disappeared, were destroyed, basically were not available. And this is particularly problematic, not only for this very interest, but for the larger process of creating a Japanese archive, an archive to study the history of the Japanese nations, the Japanese culture for the then Meiji state. And that meant that probably hundreds, more than hundreds, probably even thousands of historians, depends a bit on the definition of a historian, were collecting material to build up these archives. And Murakami Naochiro was one of the few who tried to complement the Japanese material with non-Japanese sources. And this is Murakami Naochiro, who was active over a very long period, which to some extent also explains why he collected so much and also produced so much. Because an important aspect for my work and also for what I want you to think about is that through his work, this collecting of materials, he also starts to translate the material, obviously, in order to make them available for research in Japan. But this translation process is, of course, part of this myth building and constructing of certain tropes, narratives. Then there's the selection process, which sources are included in this standard standard source compilations on Japanese history. Because what you see here is something called Dainihon Shiryo, and that's a huge monumental collection of sources that serve as reference for any scholar interested in Japanese history. And Murakami Naoshiro was in charge of these non-Western sources to be included in the Dainihon Shiryo during his work at the Historiographical Institute at Tokyo University. And in this process, of course, he also did important research on the relations between, on the presence, on the interest of Japan in Southeast Asia, especially in Luzon and in the Philippines. And because of that, he is nowadays celebrated as the pioneer of Namban history, and Namban refers to the relation to Japanese-European relations, meaning, as you probably know, actually, barbarians of the South. And that would include then also the history of Southeast Asia as seen by the Japanese during the Meiji and interwar, and also during the war period, so prior to 1945. Yes. And yeah, just because it's on the slide, he also, as I see it, he also had diplomatic functions. He was involved in foreign relations. His view of what foreign relations are and what counts was very much influenced by his career also as a university administrator, as someone who translated for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also by his involvement in building up universities. First, the College for Foreign Languages, especially with a focus on Spanish, which was one of his areas of expertise. And then, more importantly for our interests, in terms of the relationship between knowledge and imperialism, he was the first professor in Southeast Asian history or South Sea history at Taihoku Imperial University in Taipei, at this colonial institution. And this is where, so for him, this idea of engaging more with this history really starts in Japan. But then, of course, we don't entirely rely on his translations and on his work in order to get an idea, or in order to start deconstructing the popular ways of describing Japanese, Spanish or Japanese Filipino relations. There is also an enormous textual archive that is mostly Spanish. And the Spanish, of course, when they came to the Philippines and started to settle here and spread and colonize Luzon, or the area around Manila, they collected a lot of material. And in the early material, you find quite often the mention of Japanese. And that's basically because that means, of course, the Japanese came to Manila early on, but also that there were conflicts, that there were issues, and they needed to find solutions in order to determine the terms of the engagement, because the Spanish, of course, were also interested in having relations with Japan, some extent because they were interested in supporting the missionaries, the Catholic missionaries, but also because it was a very important trading partner. And here I just brought a quote from the earliest beginning, so in the 1560s, which means this would be prior to the foundation of Manila in 1571, that says here, "Veinte de ellos, hombres y mujeres, muy probablemente gente del Kyushu." So people from Japan, from the island of Kyushu. And it continues saying, among them were also Christians. And that, of course, is, there's a very easy explanation to that. The Portuguese were already in Japan then and had already founded churches and had started their missionary work and baptized various Japanese. And these Japanese that the Portuguese engaged with in Japan since the late 1540s, 1550s, were, of course, they were the people from Kyushu, so the most southern island, the one that is closest to Luzon, but also to Taiwan. But this was also the area that had the most active foreign maritime trade. So, and that's why there was a collaboration to some extent between these people from Kyushu that were not only, you know, Matale samurai, for instance, or merchants, but also the elite itself, daimyo themselves, who tried to increase their standing and their status through foreign trade and the profit that could be made through foreign trade. And the final highlighted part, llegados hace años desde Japón, would indicate that there was actually exchange, trade, and communication between Japan and Luzon prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. And one of the places from which some of these, the impetus for these trade relations came was the very, very small island of Hirado, which is considered part of Kyushu, but is actually an island, a very small island and very strategically located, rather close also to Korea. And so Hirado also has had a history of foreign maritime trade included into Chinese trading networks, contacts with because of that, very often the narrative is, yeah, this is the beginning of early Japanese-Spanish relations, without actually looking at who were the actors that navigated these relations and who were actually involved. And then if we look closer, we will find, well, obviously there is Japanese, there's people from the area, but there's also the Chinese that control a lot of this trade. And I just wanted to single out one, because for once, because it's we find him in the quite often, a Chinese, a Fujianese maritime trader by the name Li Dan. And he's actually one who had direct connections to Manila, spent several years in Manila, and then fled to Japan after he got in trouble with the Spanish authorities. And then Hirado, the history of Hirado as a global port continues for about a century. Hirado also becomes the basis for the Dutch factory, which you see on the right here. Yes. And then, this is my last Spanish quote. If we move on then to, no, sorry, I actually was a bit too quick. Just some historical background and the main dates and events in this beginning of establishment of Japanese in the Philippines. So this early phase that begins sometimes in the 1560s or 1570s is also very closely linked to a maritime phenomenon that we know as wako, which would mean, literally translated, Japanese bandits or Japanese pirates. But we now know for a long time, actually, and that's why it's a bit annoying that we need to start with this lengthy explanation. These wako were a loose group of maritime traders and sailors of various ethnicities and proto-nationalities. So the majority, very often, of these so-called wako that come to Luzon or to other islands in Southeast Asia were probably from Fujian and from other parts of China. But Japanese were among them. And what we see in the European sources is that Europeans constantly distinguish between Fujianese and Japanese, because there's often a question that you get, how were they actually able to tell? They didn't understand the language in the beginning. So there was definitely also this self-identity as Japanese or Fujianese or whatever. And then for one event that is clearly marked as an encounter and as a clash with Japanese is then the Battle of Cagayan, or what became known as the Battle of Cagayan of the year 1582, when the Spaniards heard after a while, I guess, that Japanese, a group of, again, maritime bandits, warriors, had settled in Cagayan at the most northern edge, closest to Japan, and tried to control a certain territory, and that was, of course, against the ideas of the Spaniards as the only sovereign power in Luzon, and this led to a battle and to the defeat of these Japanese in this area. And from then on, however, from the 1580s, you would gradually see Japanese coming to Manila and settling in Manila, temporary or permanently over the next 6 decades. And they actually very soon, then in the year 1584, you have the first regular trading ships sent between Manila and ports in Kyushu. And in 1604, these trading ships would become more standardized, more regular, and also it would be determined how many would sail between Manila and ports controlled by the shogunate. So there's all sorts of political developments in Japan that don't concern us so much today. What is important for us also and for Manila is that 1586 already the first designated Japanese settlement was founded in Manila in a place then referred to as Dilao, and the name Dilao, or this word Dilao, has survived as a place name in Manila. So that means that the Japanese had their own settlement just as other ethnicities, among them the Chinese, of course, had their settlements outside Intramuros, but were engaging actively with the Spaniards. And the Japanese in the early decades were closely working with the Franciscan friars, and the Franciscan friars then would also take care of them, build hospitals for them, churches, schools, etc., and as such, also very often defend them against the civil government, against the government in general. But again, this was not only benevolent. Of course, the Franciscans also hoped through that they would receive help in Japan, and they would receive support for their missionary interest in Japan. And also the relationship between the Japanese and the Franciscans were not without frictions. And then interestingly, in the year 1605, a civil officer by the name Rios Coronel issued a prohibition for the Japanese and Chinese to sleep in Intramuros. And that's a very important, even though it may not seem important aspect, because it shows us there's this popular idea that Intramuros was always closed and Intramuros was only the city for the Spaniards. But the fact that there is such a prohibition, there are several such prohibitions, actually tells us that it was common practice that Japanese and Chinese would also probably live within Intramuros. And the final point is that in 1614, this Japanese community in Manila would increase significantly, and that's because of the start of the Christian persecutions in Japan. And many Japanese who didn't want to give up the Catholic faith would leave or were forced to leave Japan, and several of them ended up in Manila. And that also means that the immigration of Japanese to the Philippines, the active immigration to Manila, would come to an end very soon, because the official relations between Spain and Japan would end in 1624, and after 1635 Japanese were no longer allowed to leave the country. So there's only this short window left. But despite that, we still find Japanese settlements, the mention of Japanese in Manila in the 18th century. And before I come to that, I will just show you this quote, because it's very important about this image about the Japanese, and also the idea of a warrior, of a samurai. What we find very often in the Spanish sources is a reference to the Japanese, as for instance, atrevida or peligrosa, basically meaning belligerent and very brave. So this is a very common trope and attribute that you find in connection with the Japanese. That, of course, tells us also that there were quite often armed struggles and conflicts between the different ethnicities. Yeah. And of course, so there's this fear of the Japanese within the Spanish community in Manila, but there's also an interest in this, this being belligerent and being brave and knowing how to handle different types of weapons. Other references are very often to Japanese bringing arms, European-style arms that they had started to produce in Kyushu at that time. So there's also this economic and military interest, and that explains why several of the Japanese actually ended up as mercenaries in the troops of the Spanish governor and were employed by them. But also, this is not a phenomenon for Spanish-Japanese relations that you also find among the Dutch in various parts of Indonesia. And in relation to that, to their ability, to their skills, but also to their availability, this is one of the incidents where we can say, yeah, they have a samurai background or they have a warrior background. They are running, looking for new masters because they lost their master after the end of the Civil War. And some of these mercenaries probably had very fluid identities. That means that they were not just warriors. At other occasions, they would be merchants, or they would even come as Christian refugees and then bring with them this ability. Another aspect is that samurai could have any sort of status. It could be a very low ranking samurai, but it could also be someone with a connection to daimyo family or daimyo background. And those could then probably be shuins and captains. And shuinsen is this formal trading ship that was licensed by the Tokugawa that was running between 1604 and 1623 between Manila and Kyushu. And then also important to mention, because we talk so much about samurai, and then of course the obvious thing to ask is, what about the women? If we only talk about samurai, women also were part, especially of this third group with Christian that fled to Manila and established here. And that's probably also an explanation why after 150 years we still speak about the Japanese community, because there was a large number of Japanese women who settled here. Yes. And this is just to prove my point. You probably know this image based on the map of Pedro Murillo Velarde, and I forgot the technical terms for these little images on the side, where you have the different ethnicities that were probably encarved by a Filipino, Nicolas de la Cruz Bagay, and one of them shows paper from it. You can read here, I don't know if you can, but I hope capons, and you would actually find here a hairstyle that you can again would be able to relate to a Japanese appearance, and that's from 1734, so more than 100 years after the last group of Japanese arrived. And now we are getting closer and closer to the actual samurai, because I would like to single out or introduce one of the few about which whom we know a bit, that a person who had samurai background or daimyo belonged to daimyo family and settled in Manila, and that's Takayama Ukon, who was born close to Osaka into a daimyo family, being feudal lords. And he was considered early on, already during his time in Japan, as a protector of Christianity, Christians, missionaries, Japanese Christians. In Japan, despite his noble heritage, despite his status as daimyo, and also despite and against the pressure of the Tokugawa shogunate to give up Christianity and to help stopping the spread of Christianity in Japan. So he lived the life as a Christian until the year 1614, when Tokugawa Ieyasu, or the shogunate, the Bakufu, issued the regulations that Christianity was not acceptable in Japan. But of course, people could stay, they would have to renounce their faith. And he was one of the many, in the case of the group that went to Manila, it was 300, but there were many more who didn't want to do that and chose to leave Japan. And of course, since they had their Christian missionary networks, that was probably not a plan he came up with himself. He had a lot of support and probably was also somehow persuaded by the missionaries, who thought if they have a good relationship with Takayama Ukon, it may help them to later on return to Japan or re-establish the mission, because no one could know by that time that this would be the beginning of the end. So he leads 148 Christians to Manila in right before Christmas in 1614. And according to Catholic sources and Spanish sources, it's a very big deal. And he welcomed, he meets the Governor General. And this is a big thing. The Jesuits are also very happy to receive them and to support them and to help them to establish in Manila. And they settle in the already existing district in Dilao, and then build another one in San Miguel, and receive a church and the infrastructure that they need. And Takayama Ukon then becomes the head of the Japanese community. There's various different terms in how he's referred to, but he has some function as a leadership, being the most high-standing person in this community. However, he died already 2 months after his arrival. So this glorious time of Takayama Ukon, a daimyo or a samurai in Manila, is rather short. But the reason that we have information about him, again, is very much linked to the written archive and to the various groups who had an interest in writing about him, but also maintaining the memory about him. And that reminds me very much about another person that could be considered a samurai with connections to Southeast Asia that is much, much better known, and that especially in Japanese historiography, and that's Yamada Nagamasa, whom you see here. And Yamada Nagamasa was a merchant, also working on these shoeings, and that I already mentioned, but not operating ships to Manila, but to Thailand and also to Taiwan. But he had very close connections with the king of Siam, and also started to work for the king of Siam. So he also, in addition to his, actually he was a low-ranking samurai, so he was not of high status in Japan, but he received a new military status in Siam. And also, just like Takayama Ukon, he became the governor of the Japanese community that had formed in Japan, in Ayutthaya, excuse me. Because, of course, Manila was no exception. Manila was part of a large trading network of port cities with very similar features, very large foreign communities, different ethnicities, different rules applying to these ethnicities, and basically being the result of an interest in trade between China and Japan, and also local communities. And he also had some diplomatic functions, tried when the Tokugawa shogunate and the king of Siam tried to establish or direct official relations. So he then was an interesting figure, maybe, and a figure of some importance in the 17th century. But all we know about Yamada Nagamasa, we know because of the enormous interest that was born at the end of the 19th century, when the Japanese, one of them being Murakami Naochiro, that I introduced in the beginning, started to when they started to look for material, and some of this, lots of this material actually, they, as I mentioned, quoting him, found in European sources. So everything we know about Yamada Nagamasa comes from Dutch sources, and then Murakami interprets that. But nevertheless, and it's not only Murakami, there is already a popular history interest in the late 1890s, when even Asahi Shimbun reports about these three characters. Sankusha means pioneer, and this is Nanshin, so the expansion to Southeast Asia. And that's this underlying narrative here, that Japan had already an interest, was already an expanding empire in the early years of the Tokugawa. And we know that because there has been literature about it. That was, of course, a common trope. You find this in the propaganda that was produced since the 1890s. But what we don't know so much about is this scientific or academic or scholarly backing that this theory received. And while this official propaganda has been debunked, obviously as a result of coming to terms with the history of the war and the armed conflict, the narratives that live on in the historiography has not been to that extent. And now that we are already in this idea of the southern expansion and the Nanshin, this is from a Japanese perspective, and now I'm talking about Japan in the late 19th century, 1890s, 1900s. A field of knowledge production that also links Taiwan to the Philippines through various channels and reasons, but basically because Taiwan becomes the center of this knowledge production and also the center of the Japanese expansion towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And in terms of scholarships for the humanities, so history only being one of them, especially anthropology, there is a lot of material that could be compared and should be explored further. And we are already at the beginning of this because there is, of course, anthropological work also done by the Spaniards and interest and connections to Taiwan. And then there's the link between Taiwan, Luzon, and Japan that can also be traced back to the early 17th century. But I'm happy to talk more about that later, but it would distract me from the actual purpose. So this is just then the beginning of this Southern expansion history. That in Japanese was perceived also as not only positively connected and not only positively received. Many critics talked already in the 1890s of this craziness of this southern expansion fever or Nanshin Netsu that had spread over stratus of society, again including former samurai or people with a noble background, who were looking for new opportunities after the end of basically in this period of modernization and the new Meiji regime that was obviously imperial power or aspiring imperial power. And in the course of this, knowledge, obviously, as for all imperial powers in that period, played a very important role. So the Japanese invested heavily in collecting material, but also in doing other kind of scientific research, sending out people to, among other places, Luzon and Taiwan, of course. And historians were part of this machinery, even though they were a bit late bloomers compared to, for instance, anthropologists or geologists. And what is important again is the foundation of Taipei Imperial University in the year 1928. And in the same year, they open a department of South and Sea history, Nanyoshi, and Murakami Naoshiro becomes the first professor of this Nanyoshi. And that's in itself an interesting topic when you think about Nanyo and Nanyoshi, or actually when you look at the curriculum of this Nanyoshi, and I don't know if anyone you had done it, but it's an extremely Eurocentric curriculum. All they do, so this has compulsory language courses. The compulsory language courses are, of course, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, maybe English. No Southeast Asian language, not even Chinese. And then there is a history. There's a couple of courses in history. All colonial history and history of European expansion. So obviously Japan tries to imitate here. It has an interest in exactly this kind of imperialism and colonial engagement with the region. And for the narrative and the knowledge about the Japanese expansion in the early modern period, one work that is linked to this department through one of the professors, Iwao Seichi, who wrote Nanyo Nihon Machi no Seisui, or this is a collection of his work published in 1937 in Taipei. And lots of this work that went into this book was carried out through Taipei by himself, of course, but also by many of the students that enrolled in the program. And when you look at the list of PhD theses that were conducted from Taipei, they all focus, or the large majority focuses on relations between East Asia and European powers and colonial systems. And so then you're probably familiar with the term Nihonmachi, Japanese town. That's something that goes back to that monograph and kind of was then perceived as a source term, but it's not. It's a constructed in the historiography. So what these people, Murakami Naoshiro, but also Iwao Seichi and many of their only Japanese students who study in Taipei do is they construct a narrative about the Japanese past that shows similarities with the European colonial engagement, and that's why I speak of an attempt to synchronize these two, or the imperial experience between Japanese and Europeans. And they also reconstruct the idea of what is Nanyo, or Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia, of course, as such, the term doesn't really exist, or only slowly comes into existence. But they operate with the term Nanyo, Southern Seas. And Murakami, and that again is a bit of a complicated long story, but Murakami actually picks up on that topic in his inaugural lecture in Taipei. And this lecture is then printed in the Japanese newspaper, in the Japanese Taiwanese newspaper. So we can assume that it was actually read by quite many literate people in the colony, in which he speaks, of course, about people like Yamada Nagamasa and he mentions Tewako, and basically gives a survey of this slow establishment of Japanese presence in Southeast Asia. He speaks of pioneers in this context, but he also, as I said, defines the Nanyo, Southeast Asia. And what Hidaki has interesting to note is that he kind of invents this term Nanyo, which of course it exists before, it's based on Chinese characters, it exists as Nanyang also in Chinese, but the word in use in previous texts and scholarships was Nanhai. And he then starts defining this Nanyo and starts introducing the history of and the genealogy of Nanyo, beginning with Núñez de Balboa and Mar del Sur. So again, here a conscious decision to start with an important event in European maritime expansion and colonial history. Right. So this is the scientific and academic part of the story. But that, of course, is closely linked to public interest that appeared during the Meiji period. And this can be traced, especially through this figure of Yamada Nagamasa. So he not only receives attention in newspapers, there is an enormous amount of publications. There's actually an article by a Japanese scholar focusing just on the amount of publications that are produced between 1920 and 1900. Anyway, before the war, in the course of around a decade, and that's between 30 or 40 books and articles. And then there is plays about him and exhibitions. So he's really his legacy and the idea of his person and his deeds is actively promoted in Japan. And Murakami Naochiro, as a serious academically trained historian in the tradition of historicism, is actually in favor of this kind of myth making. So he wants to write a neutral, objective biography of Yamada Nagamasa, and he does so in 1942. You know, really distancing himself from these propaganda textbooks and other ways of glorifying the memory. And as I said, a seriously trained academic historian at the Historiographical Institute by a German professor. All he does is source criticism, but he doesn't really problematize what he finds in the sources. So he writes this biography about Yamada Nagamasa based on the diary of a Flemish member of the East India Company, Van Vliet, that was found in the Dutch archives a few years before he started writing the book by his colleague Iwao Seiji, as you see here. So there's again this connection, and then he introduces Nagamasa as a pioneer of relations and also very much emphasizes his diplomatic qualities. And maybe in case you wonder if you recognize this man here, this is of course not Yamada Nagamasa. Who is this person on the statue? Columbus, exactly. That's Christopher Columbus. And the reason why I put him here is because Murakami compares Yamato Nagamata to Columbus and calls him the Columbus of Japan. Yeah. So this is what's going on in Taiwan, and now we've already come to the 1940s. But of course, parallel to that, there is all sort of other engagement of Japanese in the Nanyo in the course of the extension of Japanese imperialism, as most of the people in this room know much better than I do, because I'm actually an early modern historian. But what happened, of course, is that there is an enormous interest, as I mentioned before, this Nanshin Netsu in Southeast Asia, among several places, the Philippines, for various reasons. So you have interest among individuals, again, people who don't see much opportunity or a way of making a life in Japan, who would migrate and become laborers already in the 1880s and 1890s. And then there is this propaganda and popular interest in, again, broadly speaking, in the Nanshin, but very much of the Nanshin literature and fascination is actually directly directed to the Philippines. There is several publications, so fiction literature, on the idea of establishing through various means in the Philippines, and then eventually probably including the Philippines in the Japanese Empire. And two of these Japanese authors and their works I have listed here. But I think it's also important, and this is not my point, that this is a point made by the Japanese scholar Terami Wada, is that there's very little connection between this on-the-ground grassroots migration to the Philippines, who became laborers and established here, and this more intellectual interest with people who also come to the Philippines, but very often not become residents. With the very simple, they were so disconnected, and there's one very simple explanation is that this early group were probably, they were semi-skilled, they were often illiterate, so there's no way that they read this literature, and that's the reason why they ended here, and that they basically followed the same plan or had similar ideas. But what is, of course, true is with the steady increase of relations, and also with the increase of Japanese living in Luzon in late 19th and early 20th century, it's not limited, of course, to Manila as it was during the Spanish period. Many also settle in Baguio and later in Davao. But with this increase, and also with the increase of economic relations, consulate is then established in 1888. And once the Japanese established a colonial government in Taiwan in 1895, they also start sending expeditions to Taiwan. And this is not just these scholarly interest expeditions, these are also expeditions in kind of intelligence gathering and just, to survey what's going on in the Philippines, where they're very well aware that they are about to, there's a revolution already going on or about to happen, and to what extent, how should Japan position itself, and what does this mean for Japan? So in order to investigate opportunities here. Yeah, and when you read, in my case, the secondary literature about that, then you get the idea that even though there were different groups involved and there were different ideas and motivations in the development of these relations, is that many Japanese clashed with the Filipinos because of a certain ideology of superiority. And that's, of course, closely linked to the idea of Japan shouldn't aiming to become the leading nation of all Asian states. And now I have the whole slide, but I should not be very short and embarrassed. So there is increasing connections, increasing knowledge gathering, and importantly, an increasing amount of people, people with Japanese origin, Japanese background, settling in the Philippines. And then there is this interest of some Japanese with military background in supporting the Filipino Revolution. And there again, this in the end doesn't work out, even though it's quite promising. And there is definitely also individuals involved who did not try only to take advantage of the situation in the Philippines, but it was a very conflict-ridden relationship. And from the Filipino side, or from the side of the Philippine revolutionists, again, Japanese arms become important role. So there's a parallel to previous ideas of what this relationship could be based on, or what it would count in these kind of relationships. And again, an opportunity to mention women. You also have an increase in Japanese women, many of them actually coming on their own, and are to some extent involved in prostitution. In Japanese literature, they are known as karayuki. They increase enormously after the arrival of after the beginning of U.S. occupation. But they are not uninterested in terms of thinking of the idea of samurai and the idea who are the Japanese in the Philippines, and is there a connection to the warrior class and to somewhat rough people, because they were also involved in smuggling, which became a big problem, and they were also considered as very tough. So there is another popular image that came in mind when I thought about this. When you think about similar businesses, so smuggling, prostitution, other forms of illegal trade in contemporary world, you think of yakuza, and there is of course a direct link in these concepts and tropes. But what is finally important for my next and last point is that with the steady increase of Japanese and Japanese establishing in the Philippines and building relations, of course, there's also intermarriage and the spread out over the country. New associations were built in order to define the terms, to improve the relations with the people in the Philippines, but also to improve the conditions for business, for Japanese business, for instance. So you have an enormous increase in so-called friendship associations. And these friendship associations would be my argument, or my hypothesis, rather, become very important then to maintain and to promote the image, the idea, the memory of Japanese-Filipino relations. And here just a quote again with, basically now it becomes a repetition again to see that these popular images about the Japanese and all the problems with their presence from 1903, following some, I think, a killing of Japanese, where the Manila Times reports about the Japanese, refers to them as they are an army of criminals and they are tough and fearless. So very similar to a description of Japanese 300 years ago in a similar environment. And to end the story, I would return to Takayama Ukon and this actual samurai that visited Manila in 1614, because the story doesn't end with his death in 1615. The story hasn't ended yet, but it has had various episodes since 1943, when his memory was picked up by, as you can see here, the Philippine Historical Markers Committee, choosing Dilao as the former Japanese settlement to honor Japanese who assisted the Philippines in their uprising against Spain. So again, there is now another important trope or another important theme for memory, for basically improving friendship relations, and that's the revolution and the Japanese support of the revolution. But it's fascinating to see that they choose Dilao as the old place for the Japanese settlement. And then also we find another acquaintance. Murakami Naoshiro published in 1915 a letter that he found in the archives in Rome, I think, by the Pope to Takayama Ukon. And this probably will become very relevant 70 years later. And so this is just a publication in the most established historical journal in Japan. But you see here also that he not only focused on Yamada Nagamata, he was also aware of Takayama Ukon. Then in 1973, the proposal was issued for a Takayama memorial at Plaza Dilao. And this still exists, and it was part of a beautification campaign for Metro Manila. But as you can see here, so since the 1970s at the latest, you see a popular interest in this Japanese Christian. So his Christianity becomes much more important now because, of course, that's a common element that's something that many Filipinos can also relate to and care about. So the statue is then erected in 1977, and you can see it here. And the statue is particularly interesting when you directly compare it with another available image of Takayama Ukon, which you see on the right, as a part of a ukiyo-e and showing him in his samurai gear. And, this is more the samurai that you would imagine, even though most likely, I haven't seen the original yet, but this is probably a Japanese samurai gear. But yeah, so then what happens then since the 1970s, there is this various friendship initiatives and memory-making initiatives, and one, of course, in terms of citizen diplomacy, very important event is, maybe not very important event, but one episode is that Manila becomes the sister city of the hometown of Yamada, of Takayama Ukon, Takatsuki in 1979. And then there are other episodes, but I would like to finish with the grand finale, and that, of course, the beatification of Takayama Ukon as Lord Justo in very recently in 2017 by Pope Francis I. And this was basically a joint effort of Catholics in Japan, which are a minority, and Filipinos who supported this, and it actually went through. And if you follow a bit the news reporting of the period when this application was reviewed by the Pope and by the episcopal authorities, you will see very interesting quotes and references, such as Samurai's case for beatification, or even Christ Samurai. And this Christ Samurai is actually the word, sorry, we excited about this, is the wording of the Pontifical Institute for Foreign Missions, printed in Asian News. But what's more interesting about this story and its various elements and chapters is that it was very, very complicated to get through with this proposal because there was no material that could prove that he did all these great things that are necessary in order to be beatified. So then they found the solution, and the solution was to define it or to make the ground martyrdom from hatred for the faith, and that's the reason why Pope Francis beatified him. And then this Pontifical Institute for Foreign Missions, and this is maybe then my final point before I conclude, is that you find then when you look at the information that is produced in courses with whole beatification and commemorating events, again, new tropes and very problematic interpretations, because as you can see here, it says before his conversion, that's again from this news article, Justo practiced Bushido. Again, if you remember what I said, Bushido was basically the term that most of the ideology invented in the 19th century. And also he not converted, but he was baptized as a child, as young age. So what comes first, and why would it not be possible to do both at the same time, right? So this image of a Japanese warrior and a samurai that became a saint lives on until the present day in various circles. Yeah, so just to very briefly reflect on this, what these various episodes and also this knowledge trajectories shows us is just the starting point to start thinking about who and what would be a samurai in a Philippine historical context, and there is, of course, various answers to this. For a larger project, I think it's important when we engage with this to be careful not to overemphasize foreign ethnicity as part of various traits in Filipino history, but one in the history of Manila and the history of a port city. but the same could, of course, be said, for instance, for missionary history. And always to be aware that many of the historical narratives, even what we find in archival sources, but in source collections that come disguised as something that seems objective and neutral, or can be a part or the product of Southern expansion propaganda and the knowledge, or what I call empirical imperialism, that this way of this collection, this knowledge was collected. And through these narratives and also through this source collection, there is a legacy of Nihon Shinron, or Japanese superior thinking, in the scholarship on this event. But I would argue in the entire scholarship of Southeast Asia, because Japan plays an enormous role that is not really, I mean, it's sometimes problematized, but it's not really deconstructed. And that's something that we should do together jointly, because this is just a very small part of the larger story. Yeah, again, I think the gender focus is also something that I would like to emphasize and repeat here. I mean, obviously, many of these actors and the actors we have information about were men, but they were a very special kind of men. So you could start approaching this through concepts of masculinity, but at the same time, we can also at least work with the little material we have on women to include them in the story. And there were women that I haven't explicitly mentioned, but for instance, in this whole memory construction process, women were very much involved and important. Yeah, which then would lead us to these opportunities that I have already summarized, and I think I've been speaking for a long time. So I'd like to thank you for attention and here.